into the sea. Under the waves, all has been said. Can you hear them? Their voices are free. Free from the sun stare. Free from the noise of lost in exiled sound. Washed in with the tide. Their voices are free. Free from the sun stare. Free from the noise of lost souls.
You just heard Erode and The Tide from the Neurosis album, A Sun That Never Sets. This is the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And it's been a while since Neurosis.
Yes. What was the last one?
I think it was episode 101 or 102.
Almost 100 episodes.
Yeah, where we were going to decide to do a series on the kind of major albums of Neurosis, and we had done Enemy of the Sun back when we did that. And so this time we decided to pick another kind of unsung Neurosis record, which is A Sun That Never Sets. And it's kind of interesting. We, one of the places I went immediately when we decided we were going to do this for research was to the Neurosis issue that Decibel put out within like the last year and a half or so.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking at the time when that came out, like, oh, it's interesting that they chose the 3 records they did for the Hall of Fame. Like, I completely understood Through Silver and Blood. Mm-hmm. And I could see a toss-up between Enemy of the Sun and, oh boy, what's the other one from 93? Why am I forgetting that one?
Souls at Zero?
Souls at Zero, yeah. But I guess where I kind of, and you and I were talking off mic about this, like, the album that preceded this, Times of Grace, got a lot more kind of attention from maybe critics or whatever, and Decibel sort of chose that as their last of the 3 kind of Hall of Fames rather than A Sun That Never Sets. And
yeah,
I always found that kind of surprising, but I guess if you're going to talk about like a turning point in their sound, Times of Grace was a kind of a left turn for them. It's where they started to do a lot more, clean vocals for the first time, sure. Some of the more atmospheric elements, whereas I think their earlier records were a little bit more suffocating, maybe, and
mm-hmm.
The sludginess was just like almost not overwhelming, but there was like an awesome kind of glacial, destructive quality that you got with like Through Silver and Blood.
There's the tantric release thing too, where you go the entire, like when are they going to drop that? The hook into the guitar hook in, and then. Yeah, that Times of Grace just kind of like was even too tantric for me or something.
It
didn't deliver enough of what I wanted.
Yeah, I think I heard it at kind of just a weird time. And I talked to Mark before when we were kind of preparing for this that this is the record that I really got into Neurosis with. I had owned Neurosis before, and I had enjoyed Neurosis, but I think Neurosis is not a passive band. If you're going to be a passive listener with Neurosis, you probably won't get everything you need to get out of Neurosis. We've
mentioned, this is like a Tarkovsky film or something. You don't go to it every week, but
mm-hmm.
it's like something when you do watch it or you do listen to Neurosis, occupies your full attention.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
And it can be kind of exhausting. It can be kind of this album in particular, and we'll talk about that. It can be sometimes emotional depending on like what your state of mind might be.
It doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what they want you to have.
Absolutely. Yeah,
thing,
for sure. It kind of pushes your buttons and your boundaries a little bit and
expectations. It's not like, going into an AC/DC record or Dismember record. It's, what you're going to get
mm-hmm.
for the most part.
But there is like this weird like esoteric journey that you sort of have to go on to see like where they're going to take you. Like you said, it's different than a band that you have like a previous expectation for. I had owned Times of Grace. I didn't really get into it as much. I think in '99, I don't know what I was listening to. Just that album when I got it, I don't know. I just didn't put it on as much as I should have. I think the thing I found most interesting about that was how you could play that with Tribes of Neurat at the same time, and that they would kind of link together, which is the whole like Flaming Lips thing where there were like 4 different records you could play simultaneously.
Yeah.
So I found that to be kind of like fascinating. I knew that these guys were like kind of super talented, and that they, some of the things that they were doing, especially with Through Silver and Blood, had been very affecting to me. But I told Mark that it wasn't until I had gone on a trip to Canada with my girlfriend in college at the time, and it was right around August 2001, which is when this record came out, mm-hmm. that's where I really like started to process it. I think it was, it's a good driving record. It's a good record that you have some time to reflect on, mm-hmm. To sort of process like what you're kind of hearing and to sort of break some of that stuff down.
It was weird. I was jogging with a dog. Like, we're recording this the day, like Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving.
Yeah. It's a great day, great podcast day. Black Friday. It's a metal holiday.
Out jogging with the dog, and nobody was really on the streets. And it's such like a soundtrack to the apocalypse, kind mm-hmm. of, or the impending doom. It's a weird record to be running outside during the day with nobody around.
For sure. Yeah. And I kind of said, you mentioned the word apocalypse, but I wrote, it's an apocalypse in 68 minutes, but it's haunting, bleak, and beautiful, and it has like a Lovecraftian quality to it, and it's kind of overwhelming weariness. It's almost this inescapable horror that peaks with Stones at the Sky.
It's like the inevitability...
Stones from the Sky, excuse me.
Like the inevitability of doom, of impending doom, but with a triumphant, like, well, fuck this, we can get through this as well.
Yeah.
Especially with Stones from the Sea.
Stones from the Sea. I wrote sea there and sky there. It's weird.
The way this record is sequenced fantastically as far as, like, starting strong, keeping strong through the middle, and then ending on a punch and not a whimper.
It just, yeah. And when we get to Stones from the Sea, like, I have a lot to say about that. That's
just that opening weird tolling bell thing. It's just so...
It's ominous.
Yeah, it's great.
It's like a horror movie that you're sort of broken into. And, you know, what you heard there that opens the whole record up, the sort of 1-2 of the intro, Erode, and then the Tide. You know, Erode's like a interesting thing at the time. You know, 2001, I mentioned to Mark, was the year that you were starting to get a lot of this kind of weird experimental stuff in mainstream rock,
like noisy stuff,
a little bit noisier, the glitch kind of stuff, and this is very atonal. You know, it's the year of, you know, Kid A and Amnesiac, you know, this sort of Radiohead kind of bursting into not necessarily the mainstream, because I think they had already kind of been there with OK Computer and some of that, but that was like, those were big records at the time, and
that was like the height of their power.
Yeah, they kind of could do almost anything, even if it was like left of center and really uncommercial, and yet people sort of gravitated. So there was almost maybe a more experimental quality sort of in the air at that point, and I think Neurosis sort of seized on that a bit. And I think a lot of people, and some of the criticism I've seen that people have toward this record, even like the diehards, if they don't love it, a lot of them love it the way we do, is they find it to be a little bit too like esoteric, a little too minimalistic at times, a little too like goes one direction very far and another direction very far. I think some people really have an expectation. They want more of the sort of the sludginess and some of the bludgeoning qualities.
I think that this hits all those, because some of the later on ones, like Given to the Rising, Eye of Every Storm, those don't really, they're like too ponderous for me.
Yeah, those are records I don't put on as much.
Very much, you know?
Eye of Every Storm has some, to me, it's a more polished version of Sun That Never Sets, but it doesn't, it's polished almost to a fault.
It doesn't hit the highs and lows that Sun
it kind of reminds me of like some of the stuff that like Cult of Luna or Isis do. You know, I love a lot of Isis records, but some are kind of a little bit more, they're there for me. They're great to put on, but they become kind of background noise. Sometimes I don't really, you know, it doesn't always grab my attention.
Sure.
I mean, there's a few tracks that really stand out in that record that are fantastic, but as a whole piece of art, the way that this works as a whole piece of art is just, you know, kind of completely different.
Plus, this is the kind of the last record to do all the, like the visual.
Yeah.
Record. Like I saw Neurosis twice with the visual stuff, which was cool. It added something more, because they're not exactly like they just kind of sit there and rock back and forth. It's not like a super interesting band to physically watch, but having that entire DVD that did the entire 70-minute record, you know, that was a pretty interesting pairing, especially at the time. It was kind of a novelty. Not many people really did anything like that.
Yeah. And I was actually watching that DVD today, and if you don't have that DVD, it's a cool, like, kind of thought experiment.
It's probably, I'm sure it's on YouTube.
Who did it? I'm trying to remember. There was one guy in particular that produced a lot of that DVD. He did a lot of the videos and stuff like that.
Oh yeah,
I know Selden Hunt did the album cover, but I don't think it was him. It's another guy. I thought I wrote it down, but apparently I didn't. While Mark's kind of looking for that, you know, it should be said about this record, you know, Steve Albini, it's the third record that he sort of produces. I think that's another reason, like, Times of Grace gets a lot of, you know, attention, is that's the first record they did with Albini, you know, kind of moving into a different sort of direction with him. And just like that, you kind of get this great drum production on this. And one of the things about Jason Roeder's drums is it has very much like a John Bonham, like Keith Moon sort of sound, which is sort of what, you know, Albini's sort of known for that. You know, if you listen to like In Utero or some of those like Jesus Lizard records, it's just the way that the drum sort of hits. And you notice that. I mean, one of the things like Neurosis has always done, going back to like Enemy of the Sun, is like tribal drumming sometimes, and you know, they really are a percussive band in a lot of ways. And so I think that was kind of cool that the Albini's kind of adding on to that. And you notice it in songs like Falling Unknown, and then the other percussive track that we ended up not having enough time to play, and I lost where my CD went, but it's the instrumental track. I think it's track 6 or track 7. That's just a lot of sort
Watchfire?
of like,
is that it?
It might be Watchfire.
Those are the two we took out?
No, there was a third one I took out, and I literally had the CD. Oh, here it is. Jeez. It's the song that's called
From Where Its Roots Run.
From Where Its Roots Run. Okay. Yeah, and that's like a cool sort of tribal, shamanistic kind of tune, and that's sort of centered around the drums. But we kind of tried to cut out, some of the stuff to like find enough time to put this record on, because it's 68 minutes long. We couldn't play everything.
Nor does a lot of it is kind of like, just setting moods.
For
too,
sure.
So
Yeah, for sure. You start to see clean vocals kind of start creeping in around Times of Grace, and even on the Sovereign EP that Albini also sort of produced. But, even though those records and Through Silver and Blood were a little bit more sort of crushing and heavy, I think you get a little bit better kind of atmospheric sort of minimalism on this record, which I think is pretty cool. I also think this record sometimes is a little bit unpenetrable for people because it's not as traditional sounding. I don't know if I think this is one of those records that kind of requires a couple more listens. And with that, I wanted to sort of read something that was written about in Decibel, the Neurosis issue, which was a really nice resource. And if you haven't picked this up, it's worth going and ordering. And it's John Baisley from Baroness, who is definitely a band like Mastodon and Isis and Cult of Luna, and the list goes on, that owe a lot of their career to, Neurosis.
Absolutely.
And he wrote, and I'll just sort of read this, or at least read parts of it. He says, "I didn't get it on the first listen. I saw the reviews and accolades pouring in. I love Selden's artwork, and I had really fallen for Through Silver and Blood and Times of Grace. So I bought it the day it came out. Following the first spin, I was genuinely confused. Nothing had gelled. The arrangements in particular were far more expansive and substantial than I had anticipated, and there were so many melodies. Gasp. I would have, under different auspices, removed the CD and put in something that was more familiar, but I had for some reason no other CDs in my vehicle. The second spin, however, revealed the record to me. Now I heard the bells and the choirs, the strings and the pipes, the orchestra of noise, the true genius of Albini production. With A Sun That Never Sets, I had found my Pink Floyd, my Pet Sounds, my Symphony No. 9. It was contemporary music written on a scale I had thought impossible for any type of heavy band, and it resounded so deeply that since then I will not waver in offering Neurosis my true faith as a listener. You used to hear all these inane platitudes about how seeing Neurosis was like going to church or having a spiritual experience. Well, friends, I've been to church, and I've tried my darndest to have a genuine spiritual experience, and this is far greater and more fulfilling. On that drive, I heard the entirety of the human experience summed up and presented through modern sound. This wasn't as spiritual or ethereal as people seem to think. This was grounded, overripe with soul and grit. I saw my own suffering and torment reflected in the lyrics, and I had heard the ecstatic release from aforementioned distress resounding brilliantly throughout these 10 songs. And it didn't stop with, he just kind of goes on. I think he mentions, kind of comparison with like Converge as another band that he sort of gets like that weird sort of feeling. And I really would put bands like Neurosis and Converge in that same category, that they can almost sort of do anything as long as it's within this sort of atmosphere of a palette that they've sort of created. They can really move in a lot of weird directions. And
sure. That's like I think those are the best bands, to be honest. And not to always bring up Paradise Lost because they're like one of my favorites, but they're another band that set up this mold of here's our constraints. All it is atmosphere.
Yeah.
And we can sound whatever we want as long as we fall within this atmosphere.
And I feel that way with Catatonia too. That they can kind of move into a lot of different sort of directions. So
and some bands have the creative wherewithal to do that. Others are kind of, I think, like bands like Opeth, I think, struggle a little bit to incorporate all that they're capable of into their current sound, which I think is kind of lacking. But
I think Opeth sometimes too is probably cursed by ideas that he's almost like too interested in too many genres of music, and he wants to like kitchen sink a lot of things sometimes.
I think people like that need a strong producer, to be able to say
to edit them.
This is not what you needed. Like that, the stuff that most, not to turn this into an Opeth episode, but the last 3 songs of the newer-ish record that came out last year, I don't even remember what the hell it was called, but that where they start to sound like they're going off the rails a little bit, but controlled. That was the only interesting thing on the record.
I didn't really listen to that new Opeth at all, which is weird for me. I mean, I'm like a diehard Opeth fan, but like I've just been sort of generally disinterested like the last few records,
But that's another thing, like to be able to have everything, the music and lyrics and concept be cohesive, and they've had the same core members for.
Yeah,
God, ever since this record, it was. I looked up the
Von Till joined on Word Is Law, and I think he was kind of like the last big piece. I think they might have there might have been a switch with the drummer at one point.
Roeder's been there the whole time. Josh Graham was the visual media guy.
Maybe is it the other?
It's Noah Landis, the keyboard guy. There was another guy before him.
He's kind of new. Okay.
Yeah.
I knew there was one change at one point, but because we were just focused on
he's been from 95 to present.
Okay, so he joined 4 through silver then.
Yeah.
Or 4 through silver. He mentioned, Baisley did, I think, a really interesting thing there from a production standpoint or from an atmosphere standpoint. He mentioned Pet Sounds, and that's a record that, rewards you upon a lot of listens. I did not get Pet Sounds when I first heard it. One of a former friend from college, Trevor, sat me down and really tried to show me that record. But now that I've taught the Beach Boys and I've taught Pet Sounds and I've read books on it, I appreciate it on profound levels. And I had a student when we were talking about Pet Sounds and listening to some of the songs on Pet Sounds this year. She was just in tears. She couldn't it was evoking things from her childhood and from her experiences of being leased in high school and
learning
that Brian Wilson was
learning the background of everything outside of just the music itself it adds an entirely different depth.
But I think you can get that out of a record like this because it has that sort of weird, the way it's produced, the way you said it's sequenced in a certain way. It works as a whole complete work of art in a way that I don't think. I'm not saying the other Neurosis stuff that preceded it didn't, because I think it does. I think that's the thing about Neurosis. They're an album band, not a singles band. And one of the reasons I was telling you that I didn't get into Neurosis when I was in high school is I think it was just lack of patience. I didn't have the time to invest because I was doing high school things. I didn't sit around I didn't have 65 minutes to just sit with my headphones. I was listening to music in cars with people riding in cars, and you just don't put Neurosis on in cars when you're trying to listen to it. It just becomes background noise. But one other kind of weird element that was starting to come in, I know where I was going with the Pet Sounds thing. This is almost like a record. It's almost like you took those first few 4 Godflesh records and had them sort of produced by Brian Wilson or Phil Spector. It's got the sheen of a wall of sound that's really beautiful at times, but there's that apocalyptic Godflesh kind of thing running underneath it all, but it's these two weird worlds kind of colliding. I think this is really where the matching of those two elements fits the best for me, is this record.
I would agree with that.
But another sort of weird thing is Scott Kelly, who obviously is writing a lot of the music. Scott Kelly and Steve Von Till are kind of the two guitar players, the two vocalists, the two main songwriters, main lyricists. He said that before he made this record, one thing that was kind of starting to seep into his consciousness that he wasn't really even aware of is when they were on the tours that they were on for so long through the mid 90s and late 90s sort of period. Whenever
one of them was Pantera as well.
Yeah. I listened to the interview. Pantera was one of the first bands to really help them out and stuff. But he said when he was trying to sleep on the tour van, he was listening to a lot of folk and country records on his headphones. And to me, you hear the opening of the Tide to kind of get back to where we sort of started here.
Which almost has an At the Gates-ish, that weird mechanized kind of thing.
Oh, no, that's are you talking about?
Erode.
Erode has that. When you finally get to Tide, you get this, it's almost like a disturbingly quiet intro. Yeah. You hear,
for
wind
a minute and a half.
Blowing and stuff. Yeah. Really kind of cool stuff. And one of the elements they brought in, again, I think the more I researched this record, the more I started to, I think, appreciate Times of Grace and how that was a real turn for them. But in a way that I like Last Fair Deal Gone better than Discouraged Ones from Catatonic, even though I recognize that Discouraged One is the huge turn for them.
Yeah.
You get what I mean? To me, this is a more refined version of what they were doing with Times of Grace.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that they added, besides Albini and besides clean vocals, is Chris Force, who ended up marrying, and then Kristen Von Till from Amber Asylum. Came onto this record, and they're bringing violins and the viola and some of these different kind of layers. So it's no longer just keyboards and synths and some of the sampling. Yeah. It's a real organic kind of layering, and you really start to pull it out. And you hear that in the opening of the Tide with the folk guitar and the viola, and you get these just kind of different dynamics. And a lot of bands who tried to do stuff like this come off pretentious, but for some reason Neurosis sounds so honest with their lyrics and with what the way they're assembling the music. Yeah. They're not putting on airs, even though you could accuse them of being cute with all these different sort of things that they're kind of adding onto the music.
Yeah, there's never, no matter what any of their records sound like, some are more satisfying than others, depending on your personal taste or whatever, but they seem to have, I'm not sure where they, when they go to write, if everybody's bringing in ideas or if it's just like a couple people, or it seems like they're all writing as a band.
Yeah,
and start. It's not like there's riffs that are already here. It's like this is maybe like what we're thinking of for a direction of the thing. We want to incorporate more of this chaotic element or whatever into it. But
Albini said one of the reasons he really likes working with them and respects them is the way they do interact in the studio. That it's not like a veto power of like one band member or something like that. That they really do kind of work out things organically, and so the songs reflect that. So it's not like dominated by one personality more than another. It's whatever the best idea moving forward is going to be. I think one of the things I like about the Tide too is the at this point to me it was the best sort of clean vocals that I had heard from Von Til. It has like a real Nick Cave quality to it. He doesn't sound like Nick Cave, but like the way Nick Cave can be like dark and ominous with that deep sort of voice.
Well, he's able to sing with still like he's got razors in the back, in the back of his throat,
like Tom Waits almost too.
But way better in my opinion. I'm not a fan.
Yeah, I appreciate Tom Waits a lot. I always think of River of Men from Fishing with John when I
appreciate him as a character more than a musician.
Yeah.
It's like the drunk troubadour kind of thing he's got going on. It's fine, but I'd rather just see you acting than.
And I'm more of a Beefheart guy. I'd rather go to the source and listen to some Captain Beefheart. So, but you've got bagpipes come later from the Hill, but you
not
have
like Korn either.
What's that?
Not like Korn.
Not like Korn's bagpipes. But you get this like kind of avant-garde sort of quality, and I think Nick Cave and some of these people are like probably some of their weird influences. And the thing I was trying to draw with, attention with Mark is, when we were talking before, is, you have some records that were really similar to Sun That Never Sets beyond Neurosis at this point. Mogwai had put out Young Team in 1997, and you had like songs like Herod that had this sort of crushing sort of build to it. The first mono record, a Japanese kind of band, came out in 2001. Godspeed You Black Emperor had debuted in 98, and I feel like this record is probably the closest Neurosis gets to like doing some of the things that like Godspeed You Black Emperor does.
Sure.
This like disarming symphony kind of quality to it,
Didn't like Pelican like Red Sparrows and shit come out similarly?
Yeah, around the same time, but I think Pelican was maybe like a year later or so, but I don't know.
But this was kind of like this was like the crest of the
this is the beginning of that sort of like post rock or whatever. Isis Oceanic I think came out like in 2000. Or no, not Celestial came out in 2000. I think 2002 was Oceanic. Okay. So like, this album's 2001. It's right in the middle of those two like pivotal, like ISIS sort of emerging and becoming like a force to be reckoned with. So it's interesting. I don't know where they were drawing their influences from. Like you hear some indie rock elements that we'll talk about a little bit later, Slint, and there's even like a little Mogwai sequence. I'm sure these guys were like hip to everything,
Sure.
But I don't think they were copying anyone. They're just doing Neurosis things. But
I think they seem like they're dead serious about the band. So like whatever kind of fit into their like aggregator or whatever outside, it didn't matter what it was or where it came from as long as it kind of fit their criteria. It seems like that stuff kind of makes its way.
Yeah.
And because with that kind of sound, tribal drumming and shit isn't really what I would expect to come in. But I think at the root of everything about Neurosis is that they're trying to, in a modern context, represent some kind of like some like primal music.
For sure. Get back to like the beginnings.
Yeah, and like honest emotions and honest sounds and all that kind of stuff, I think, makes it into this record a lot.
Well, it's funny you mention that because there is a great lyric that sort of happens, and I think it really is, to me, the thesis statement kind of where the band is at this point. And the line says, "A time to think back and move on." And I think that's kind of where they're at. They're sort of taking kind of a toll of where they're at, where they've gone their whole career, starting as a hardcore band up through Silver and Blood, and they talk about how emotional doing that touring for that record was. It just took a lot out of them, and then so Times of Grace is almost they're like, all right, we're gonna change some things up or whatever. But to me, this is like, Sun That Never Sets is reflecting on like their whole like kind of totality at that point, and kind of the human experience too. I mean, not that their other albums shied away from that, but there's a lot of lyrics that sort of jump out on this record all over the place that are really contemplative about a lot of things, which leads us into our next song that we're going to sort of get into. We got a pair of songs coming up, From the Hill and A Sun That Never Sets, the title track. And From the Hill, I wrote, it's like, because of the bagpipes, it has like this quality to it that's like, I wrote, it's like a Scottish baton death march, you know, it's just like, it's just this like, you know, this to me, like I'd almost rather listen to From the Hill rather than some of the Funeral Doom stuff that I hear. And I like Funeral Doom at times when it hits me, but to me, like, From the Hill is like true funeral. Like, this is like leading to something. It's
a processional.
Yeah.
You know, it's,
this
whole record's like almost like a processional to death.
It's leading to like the unraveling that happens at the end of Stones from the Sky, I think is both, you know, it's symbolic of a lot of things.
It's like, well, it's all going to shit, but you have the option to change.
For sure. You know, and one of the things I like about the From the Hill song is that it has like this kind of shimmering quality, especially like kind of near the end, and you get like a aura to it that reminds me of some of the things that like you hear on like Brave Murder Day, or even some of the stuff like Alcest or Primordial does, or even Agalach. You know, you could tell those bands probably heard some of this kind of stuff. Yeah,
because especially the organic sounds of everything too, and like putting in stuff that I wouldn't normally. Like, my wife heard Primordial, and we saw them at Maryland Death Fest a couple years ago. And she was like, I love this band. I was like, it's like Thin Lizzy. Like, it's that dun-dun-dun-dun-dun-dun. Like, it's got the whole, like, the traditional, like, Gaelic singing kind of thing happening, the sing-songy stuff. And it's like, yeah, they're just, like, the way they do that and scream, like, it all just, I love it. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I can still see them as, you know, kind of...
connected to what they're doing here
in a weird way. And also that was God, what was it Journey's End? Was that the one that came out in the early 2000s, the primary where they first started doing like a lot of like triumphant singing and shit?
Like with the Rome song, and I know what you're talking about. I can't remember what record that is.
Women!
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and kill your family.
It was great. Yeah, no, I love that's something I love about Primordial, and I'm not saying that they have a sing-song quality. Neurosis does, because they don't necessarily, unless you're talking about kind of the end of Falling Unknown.
But I think Primordial, they're taking their early historical, you know, from Ireland. They're taking their early cultural roots and incorporating it into, you know, a metal record. And Neurosis is doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
They're taking like Americana, you know, Hank Williams sounds, bringing that into this like, you know, post-punk.
Yeah,
whatever you can. I don't even know what the fuck you call.
Yeah. I mean, people have trying to pinpoint Neurosis forever, you know, and I see them as a representation of heaviness. I don't even know if I would call them metal all the time. You know, heavy is like such a weird word, you know. But I think they're beyond that.
The Spirit of Earth Aflame was 2000. That was the one that really, like, they started bringing a lot of that shit into it.
Yep. I think I was thinking of the records for more of the late 2000s is what I thought you were kind of referring to. But, you know, you get with the title track kind of a weird, unsettling sort of, like, crackle effect that, like, like I don't even know what it is, but it's like that weird, like, percussive thing, and it's like, it's a cool sound effect, but, like, it adds like kind of a traditional sort of doomy quality to the band, but like he says some things in it lyrically where he says like stuff like, the blood that flows through me is not my own, the blood is from the past, not my own, the blood that leads my life is not my own, the blood is strength, I'm not alone. And there's like this cool like arc of civilization or arc of like tribalism things like that that's sort of there. You know, I mean, A Sun That Never Sets, it's this sort of idea that like you said, this record's like apocalyptic and there's a Lovecraftian sort of like impending doom quality, but yet like a song like that is like triumphant in a way. You know, I mean, the term A Sun That Never Sets, if you dissect that, is this idea of like you're always around on some level, like nothing's going to like get you down on some level. I mean, not to get like psychological about it, but it is a cool sort of like statement and a cool way of saying like, even though this impending doom or like all of this like chaos is happening around you, like you still exist if you want to exist, you know, but you have to like make yourself exist.
You still have stake in the game at this point.
Yeah.
And there's the nuclear ideas behind that, you know, phrase as well. The not the nuclear winter, but the whatever you call it.
I think it comes from, if I believe the historical roots are the British Empire.
Okay.
The whole idea that when they controlled so much of the planet, the sun never set on the British Empire and stuff. So they're taking kind of like a imperialistic sort of thing, but like kind of organically linking it more to like sort of tribal survivalism or something like that.
You can tell these guys are like students of history and interested in,
Yeah, they're definitely into a lot of cool things, you know. So
metaphysical shit, it's all, they're hitting that, they're at that age too where like we can't just be angry. Like we have to be angry about something.
They did the hardcore stuff in like the late 80s and early 90s before, and now they're kind of moving on. They're definitely, this is a big step forward from a maturity standpoint. Absolutely. Sure. So you're going to hear a pair of songs here, From the Hill and A Sun That Never Sets, and we will come back and then talk about a couple of big ones after that. So enjoy.
Stealing
That was The Sun That Never Sets and From the Hill. Well, Mark, that first talk set went a little longer than we thought.
It's 30 minutes. This might be our longest single talk set we've ever done.
We did not mean to do that. And so after recording that, we decided to call the old sports audible, the old Hail Mary, and change up plans a little bit. So we have now officially turned this into a 2-part episode, even though it's really
on one album.
Yeah.
Is this an unprecedented event?
It is. It is. World famous. We've never done anything quite like this. Actually, it's not unprecedented. We accidentally did it with Dimmu Borgir. That was actually technically one album.
Oh, that's Chris. Right. Okay.
Damn. All right.
It was real close, though.
This will be
longer.
This is going to be definitely... We're going to consciously make this a 2-parter. That one just was for time's sake.
Yeah, just the bandwidth limitations we had.
Exactly. And so we're going to reinsert some of the songs that we were originally going to cut out for time's sake. So now which
we mentioned early on.
Exactly. So we've totally thrown a little audible on that one, but it's okay because we actually have a lot to say, especially about this song that we're going to kind of end, I guess, part 1 of your download. Hopefully you'll be able to download these kind of at the same time as
we're going to upload them at the same time.
And that's Falling Unknown. And boy, I got a lot to say about this record. Or about this song. What are your thoughts on this song? Because I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I'll pick your brain first. It's the centerpiece. 13 minutes, probably the longest.
Yeah, the longest song on the record. The longest sustained
drumming.
The snare roll. It's kind of like a high school marching band kind of like exercise that keeps going on. But that's, as somebody who dabbles in playing instruments, it's an insanely long time to be doing that marching beat on the snare.
Yeah, it's very hypnotic, therapeutic. It's got the...
It has this weird undulation to it that's not just like strict.
Oscillating kind of like element to it. Yeah,
and it really takes... I didn't actually map it out to see how many minutes it took out of the 13:10 or something? Mm-hmm. How long that was?
It starts at 6 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it goes until...
13:10. Well, no, it goes till
12:16.
Yeah, because that's the last minute's when the big explosion happens. Yeah.
Which talk about like this album might be the weirdest as far as it's not operating on chorus verse. The traditional songwriting structures, like usually you have, you build up to the hook that's maybe halfway through the song, you repeat it maybe a couple times in the chorus. This is like this building to the very end, and then punches you right in the face, and then it's done.
Yeah,
that's a pretty like unconventional way of ending a song.
It's like it's like a meteor hitting or an it's so strange. I mean, I wrote that some people made mention that the kind of classical orchestra guy that did like the quiet loud dynamic probably more than anyone was a guy Kurt Mahler. Mm-hmm. And I sort of said it's like Kurt Mahler meets the Pixies, because the Pixies were always known for the quiet, loud dynamic, which is what Nirvana stole.
Yep.
And made like so evocative. And this is like kind of taking that to like a new level. And I think Falling Unknown is exactly kind of what you're talking about. Because what's weird about it is, you get these really great, amazing vocals from Scott Kelly in the first like 5 or 6 minutes. He's kind of... I mean, it's sort of deceptive, right? Like the first 6 minutes feels like, if you're a listener, it really feels like you're just listening to kind of a normal Neurosis kind of sludge song. There's not anything like out of the ordinary about those first like 5 or 6 minutes, And then all of a sudden the music cuts out, and then you just hear this like, and it's just, I'll just read what I wrote because it's ramblings of an idiot here. I said, then all the music cuts out, and it's like a spirit quest begins. You're like on this like sort of like cosmic journey to find some sort of truth. And what I wrote is, I said, you're trying to discover some type of cosmic truth about music's ability to transcend the material realm and enter the spiritual realm. It's powerful and disarming, and if you're vulnerable, this can be very emotional and very alarming.
I mean, it's like Rotor starting like this shamanistic journey, and then everybody starts coming in with different vocals, like,
and you hear like violins and violas start to enter, and then like things just like like the drama just builds.
It's a very Native American, it's the most Native American sounding aesthetically song that I think that Neurosis has ever.
Yeah, outside of that one, what was it, Tannenhaus? I think from Enemy of the Sun, where it's just like a lot of drums and different things.
But this is like bringing in like all the voices, everything.
This is the whole sort of thing, and I said when all these elements kind of come together, and it's actually in this song they get I forget the guy's name. It might be Noah, or maybe Dave sings a little bit. Edwardson, the bass player.
Yeah, he always does backing vocals.
Okay, so
I think Noah does backing vocals too.
Okay, so what happens is at the very end, all the three voices start to intertwine with each other.
4.
Okay, so it might be 4 in this song. And like to me, like that's like if you're in like a weird place, like the nerves like really exposed at that point. Like that part can be like alarming. And I was telling you, I played this, or I had a friend of mine sort of listen to this, and she said like she's not familiar with Neurosis or metal or anything, and she said she cried. Like it overwhelmed her a little bit. And driving, I listened to this song 3 times in a row driving, just to like, I almost wanted to see if I could, it's like taking peyote, like a smoke, like, I wanted to like push myself, like really like mess myself up a little bit. And it did mess me up a bit. Like listening to this 3 times in a row, I was like, I want to go there.
It's a weird version of, like, you ever do like round robin in elementary school where you start doing row, row, row your boat, where one person starts, then the next person, that's how, but it does it reverse of the same thing. It's a interesting and dynamic.
And those voices just like kind of all the music cuts out. And then like, they're like, and then
they're all raw nerve. Like they're just it's 10th take or whatever. They've been doing this all day. Everybody's like on their, the last leg, and then that.
And then the huge payoff moment. Yeah, the get down.
It's only like
part.
4 or 5 notes or something, but it's just like Jesus.
It's
the way it's produced is amazing.
And what they're singing, if you're not familiar with their lyrics, is they're just saying at the end they're falling through a world unknown, and it's just like, man. And there's some lyrics in here that like again are disarming when he says like under the cloud cover, the flare signal change. Will you ever know? And again, I talked about the lyrics earlier about how this is a significant kind of step forward for this band into kind of a more vulnerable place. But, like, is your heart still beating? Can you feel this at all? This landslide will bury us all. With the storm on your mind and the clouds in your eyes, will you survive, falling through a world unknown? And, like... And you're in it, man. And I said, like, this song in particular reminds me of some of the more, like, avant-garde classical music that a friend of ours, our old manager that's been on the podcast before, Mike Johnston, got me into. A guy named Charles Ives, who did a lot of stuff in, like, the early, like, 1910s, 1920s. Him and, like, Stravinsky were pretty, like, avant, like, for classical music.
Wasn't that, was it the classical contemporary? Is that what it's called or something?
Yeah, contemporary classical. Yep.
Which is weird that to be named that, being from the early 1900s.
Exactly. But it was more sophisticated.
It was pushing away from like the traditions of the past.
And so like a guy like him, or like even like Toru Takamitsu, who did like a lot of film scores, especially for Akira Kurosawa. And Morton Feldman, another kind of avant guy.
60s guys.
Yeah, a lot of, those sort 60s. Of guys. They're like building these.
Did you throw Cage into that category?
John Cage, I think sometimes when he's like focused, like, but even then, like John Cage is bringing a lot of different instruments in and like really like kind of disarming you as a listener. And I think those classical music guys like really explored like these kind of extreme kind of psychological tensions, and you hear that in like some of the film scores that they sort of inspired. You hear it in like Lynch's music or Lynch's movies. One of the reasons people like I find a lot of Lynch movies more terrifying than like traditional horror is because he's exposing nerves that like don't get exposed in mainstream cinema. Like he's really
everything's like, psychological.
He's attacking things that are like taboo and uncomfortable to kind of like confront in a way. And I feel like you get to a song like Falling Unknown, and to me like this song and Stones from the Sea are like probably my 2 favorite Neurosis songs. I mean, I love Locust Star and I love a few other, but like these songs I get like a real emotional like experience from. You know?
They're overwhelming.
Yeah, it's and like I said, I tried to push it to see where I could go by listening 3 times in a row. I don't know if it was healthy or not, but I did it, And so it's taking, if you're familiar with Times of Grace, there was a song on there called, no, it wasn't Times of Grace. Maybe it was through Silver and Blood, but Strength of Fates was the name of the song. Mm-hmm. And that song is like probably the most tense, or one of the first really, really, really tense building explosion kind of Neurosis songs.
Yeah, it's through Silver.
Is it through Silver?
Yeah.
All right, and it's kind of taking it to like its logical conclusion. It's like taking it as almost as far as a concept as you can go. Like, I don't think they can do another song like this. They had a song that was kind of similar on, it was either Given the Rising or what's the Honor.
I always think Honor, Valor, Pride.
Found Honor, Glory. Yeah, I know. I always think of the Bolt Thrower record. But there was a song.
Honor, Found, and Decay.
Yeah, so that song had one centerpiece tune that kind of had like a release moment to it as well. But it's a different approach to music. It's tantric, maybe, is a term that gets kind of thrown around. I know a lot of people, and Baisley sort of called people out in his thing that, they like to call it like spiritual music, but he says it even goes beyond that, And myself, I'm not a spiritual person in terms of like traditional, like sort of church or whatever, but like I can get like a spiritual quality out of this that like you don't get with like a lot of music.
I think it's spiritual it's a loaded word, but I think transcendent music that takes you somewhere that you can't go on your own. Mm-hmm. I think that's like a modern version of spirituality. I think people are too focused on like organized religions and things like that to actually mean spiritual. But I think as human beings, we need spiritual experiences, like,
for sure,
to transcend our mundane lives.
And for me, it's always been music, and sometimes film. It just sort of depends. Like I talked about this in my rock history class. I played my kids, when we got to funk music, I played a Maggot Brain, and I said, this is like spiritual to me. Like listening to Eddie Hazel like play, just go. It's the kind of thing that Hendrix would sometimes do. You tap into this sort of like cosmic sort of like energy, and like you said, transcend things. It's not music; it's an experience that you're sort of part of. Mm-hmm. And I think it made sense why, like, as they're putting this record together, that they would want to put it together like a DVD, like what you had, where you're linking visuals and you're linking.
It's like a full sensory experience.
Yeah, like it's a total immersion into like this music, and I think this is the centerpiece song for that in a way. This, and I think Stones from the Sea, which we'll talk about in part 2 a little bit more.
But the era this came out, this is kind of the last time you could do that, where it's not like, this is before the internet was ubiquitous everywhere.
Yeah.
We had emails or whatever, but as far as like downloading videos and that kind of shit, it wasn't, you couldn't just watch shit on your phone. You couldn't say, hey.
Remember how excited you got when like you bought a CD and it said it had a CD-ROM video? And you're like, oh.
Lost in Cursive Reverence really video, forever.
That was like crazy. Yeah, QuickTime.
But this was like, this was like the last gasp of an era where just, you could see it was on the horizon, like everything, you could see everything pretty soon, like no matter what, like, hey, I want to see this whatever Jimmy Stewart movie, and I want to hear this, and blah blah blah. It was you had access to everything.
Yeah.
And this was like the last gasp to say, this, sit down, watch this, listen to this, be immersed by this without any outside.
And I have a specific memory. I was telling you of a friend of ours who does listen to the podcast, named Chris True, who came over, and we sat and watched like the whole thing, and like, we didn't do drugs, but boy, it sure felt like it. Like you feel like kind of physically changed a little bit after like watching like all these like colors and videos and things kind of happening, along with just the music itself is pretty all involving. But then you add that other element. So it's
this album really works on, I think, on 2 levels, because it's like there's the curated visual experience that they offer on that DVD. But the thing that I think is really impressive about this record is that you don't need that, because it's so evocative on its own. Like what we talked about earlier, like you driving and having this experience. I was, jogging with a dog, the same thing. Like it's so, I think it taps into some sort of like primal need in us, sitting like drum circles.
Yeah.
It totally has that kind of vibe. It's like, we're going to tell a story.
First form of human communication.
Yeah. We're going to have a story through human interaction and music.
Yeah.
And that was, predating language. That was what drew us together.
And I remember Mike telling me that they've discovered some tribes that still communicate like using drums, like in the deep roots of like Congo and some of those sort of areas that were like undisturbed by like any kind of like modern technologies and
there's so
Europeans
few
stuff
of
like
those
that,
things left. It's kind of insane to think that still exists in this And really, they have it right. If you look at what would happen in some kind of like, cataclysm,
they're going to live.
Who's equipped to deal with no technology, no running water, no electricity, all this kind of shit?
For sure.
Those guys.
Yeah. I was just talking with my current student teacher, who's a military guy, and he was kind of talking about, if like North Korea cut the power grid, he kind of like talked me through like the 5-step process, like that they're trained as military to know like how to do. He was like, you want to probably have about a week's or 2 weeks worth of food already like ready to go, because the shelves will be empty in like 2 days.
Yeah.
And he said, I would probably go north. So don't go south, because that's where everyone else is going to go.
Yeah.
And it's just going to be, and even north, you got to get somewhere like that's depopulated a little bit, but where you can like get access to some food.
Not too cold, where you can either hunt, fish, get firewood.
It's fascinating. We as a society are not ready to deal with that,
Well, I think that's why like there's all this like back to, not to completely go off the rails, but people that I'd say within the last 10 years, there's this fascination with craft again. Like people want to know how beer's made and how like furniture's made, and I think we have to have.
We got too factory modeled, industrialized to the point where we were assembly line everything. Industrialized
we need
food.
We need to know how stuff. We need to have our hands make something. It can't just be virtual through the computer. It has to be something. Yeah, I think like that's hardwired into our DNA, where we've got to go back and do something. You need to exercise or learn how to cook or garden or one of those things that's not linked with technology. Yeah, because you need to be. I don't know. Every couple of years, me and my wife go to this place up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. We're one of the only state that has two literal parts. But we go to this place where there's no cell coverage. It's a single campsite up in the middle of Hiawatha National Forest. One campsite on a peninsula in a lake. It's amazing how everything that was stressing you out back in the physical world about how much you need, money for this or this bill's due, is like it's all gone.
You get grounded, yeah.
And there was a time last time we were up there, she got sick and it was rainy and just kind of miserable out, and all that mattered was keeping the fire going to stay warm.
You were on Survivor,
and it's like like how quickly all this shit falls away when real things matter, Yeah,
and people talk, I've been on some Survivor podcasts before, and Mark and I, when we lived together, watched it quite regularly. I'm still a pretty big fan of it, but I think one of the things where that show was initially kicked off is people are fascinated by the idea of stripping yourself of like the modern, elements and getting back to like your roots of like who we are, and you get I think you get a singular kind of focus. You get that when you travel sometimes, when you're away from things. And
I know when I was in Thailand, I didn't care about anything outside of what our goal was. Yeah, I could you revert right back to that, not the reptile brain, but just past the reptile brain, the survivalist thing. Like my tribe needs to make it through. What do we need? Yeah.
So, and to say that you can get that from music is, I think, what I think helps put a band like Neurosis in some kind of historical perspective, because I think it was in the Albini interview, he talked about the first time he like went to like Neurosis concerts. I think it was before he even produced them, and he said he saw people that were there regardless. They were just going to be there because it was a show. And then he said he saw people that were intellectually like getting everything that Neurosis was doing on like a deep, like really profound level. And he said that's what like impressed him about the band. And when he started to work with them, and I think he's done like the last 7 records or 5 records with them. And what's impressed them is just the layers of depth that they put into like not just like their music, but like all the tattoos that are on their body and like all these just different things that like it's all one total package. And the people that really get Neurosis like get Neurosis. And I remember that. I think I found that intimidating when I first kind of got into Neurosis around just even before this. Like it seemed like people were like die hard about it, and I didn't get it. And I was like, oh, okay. Like they seem like a really cool band, but I don't get why people like lose their shit over them until this record. And I was like, oh, all right. I'm starting to kind of like get it. They're doing things like on a different level that like
it's kind of their most refined outing up to that point too, where it wasn't it wasn't impenetrable to get into, you know?
I think you could get people on this record that maybe weren't into a lot of heavy music. Like, I remember playing this for my girlfriend at the time when I think I talked about the trip up in Canada, and she really thought it was like a beautiful record at times. You know, like, you know, the opening of The Tide, you know, a song like The Sun That Never Sets, which is like, there's a warmth to that song, even though it's doomy and it's got these things, but like, you know, he's saying these inspirational things, and like, you can tell it's not, you know, when you play death metal for people, sometimes it's like you lose them on a lot of levels, you know, right away, because there's just nothing accessible sometimes for them other than maybe like a groove or something, but like the vocals bother them, or, you know, something's
the lyrics are usually completely out of their wheelhouse. Yeah. But there's a severe honesty to this, and it's genuine.
Yeah.
There's no pretension to anything Neurosis has ever done, which is a real hard act to do with something when you're talking about serious stuff without a sense of humor at all.
Yeah.
And still succeed, you know, 12 albums.
That's right. Like, I mean, I put them in that rare category of like the Converges of the world. Like, Converge, just kind of whatever they do is like a moment. Like, people like I don't know. I like some Converge records better than others, and I like some Neurosis records better than others. But like, I've never heard like a bad Neurosis record. I've never really heard. You know, there's records I pull out a lot more than others. You know, especially
Converge. I'd say anything post Jane Doe and after is.
Yeah, and I would even like the couple before that, but they're different. Jane Doe is definitely like the turning point. You know, it's kind of like Word is Law and stuff like that. Like, those are like okay records for Neurosis, but I just don't pull them out like the other stuff.
Yeah, that stuff, it's not indicative of what they really became.
They're still more evolving.
Like, it's like amoebics worship kind of stuff. It's not really them yet. You know.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess, you know, what I would say is, as we kind of close out part one of this kind of double-sized episode, is, you know, get to a comfortable place, maybe. You know, there's a great moment on the live Tool record that came out right around the time of Latrellis, or right before Latrellis, where they play a live version of I can't remember the song. It's got a lot of like tablas and drumming and things like that. It's from Enema. It's not Third Eye. I'll have to look it up later, but he says, I want you to, you know, he's talking to the audience, Maynard is, and he says, I want you to find, like, go to a vulnerable place, and like, really, like, we're going to like change this song, and like, we want you to come with us, but you gotta like mentally prepare for it, because otherwise it's gonna go right over your head. And I kind of appreciated that, because like, he's being honest. He's kind of saying, like, we're about to do something that's kind of like spiritual. It's gonna be really weird, and you can be with us, or you can be that one guy being like, what are they doing? You know, like, why are they just playing the same tribal beats and drum beats for like 5 straight minutes? It's like, no,
I think he's a big hallucinogen guy.
Yeah, for sure he is.
He was on. I heard him on. He was on Joe Rogan's podcast.
Oh, was he?
A while ago? I think they're talking about DMT or something.
Got it.
Which is
well, I've been to his winery out in Arizona before.
Okay,
I did.
My cousin worked for him.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
For sure, you can tell
he's interesting. I mean, he's a weird. There's very few people that like bands like Tool, which are a more successful version of Neurosis.
Kind of really are, in a weird way.
Like, they have the opportunity to kind of do whatever. They're their own entity. They don't really fall in any genre. I mean, Neurosis are kind of in a genre, but there's something that's impenetrable. Jesus. About Neurosis that's never going to hit the heights of, you know, a band like Tool. But I think they're in the same mindset.
Yeah, I think a band like Radiohead, you know, those kind of bands that are going to like transcend generations. You know, I mean, the Beatles sort of did that. Like, just kind of do whatever the hell they wanted, and they did some really fucked up shit.
The Beatles are still being rediscovered and interpreted.
And I think there's going to be a canon for a band like Neurosis, like years from now, where people like who maybe avoided them because they got tagged as being like metal or something that's like disreputable. You know, metal is obviously looked down upon. That you can kind of get away from that and kind of go, ooh, well, you know, the guy that was producing like PJ Harvey and Nirvana.
You got to look at that.
You know, like, there's a reason Steve Albini's interested in doing shit with this band. It's not because like he's just getting paid. It's not a paycheck.
No, and you look at his discography, Steve Albini's. He doesn't work with a whole lot of bands long term.
Exactly.
So obviously there's like a deep respect.
Tells you something pretty unique about it. So hopefully, you know, again, you can expose your own nerve with a song like this. If you're unfamiliar with this record, or maybe you've heard Falling Unknown a ton of times, I think you'll enjoy it. So we're not going to say official goodbyes, but we will say this is it for part 1. So enjoy Falling Unknown as we sort of close things out, and then we'll be back with some more Neurosis action.
your back.